Welcome to another edition of HSRC Connect. This is Odidi Matai-Sigutla, and I'll be hosting today's panel discussion titled Reimagining Africa's Future Through AI. But before we explore today's topic, let me first welcome our esteemed experts. Chris Chetty, Senior Research Manager at HSRC, leading the development of AI-powered career guidance tools for Africa's youth. Michael Gastro, Director of the HSRC Center for Science in Society, and interested in the formulation of national AI policies and responsible for AI practices. And joining us online, Rachel Adams, the founder and CEO of the Global Center on AI Governance, specializing in AI ethics and governance frameworks. Welcome. It is an honor to have you all here. Now, while AI has the potential to entrench inequality, amplify existing exclusions, it also offers tools to build responsive systems for career guidance, public policy, and social equity, if governed wisely, deployed inclusively, and designed contextually. But before we explore this topic, I would like you to explain, and this is open to all the panelists, what exactly is AI and what are the current capabilities and limitations of AI?
Anyone want to take that? So if we think about what is AI, so that's a big question. AI keeps improving. The way I like to think about it is an artificial brain. So these AI systems, they work based on a neural network, and it's identifying many different connections between different data points. And just as a human brain will try to make sense of the world that it sees, the understanding that it has, the AI system also goes through, builds its own understanding about what this world how it works, but digitally examining its neural network. So these networks are getting more and more impressive, more powerful, and I think it's very important that we become aware about what is happening in this space, because it has huge impacts for all of society. I mean, you're starting to automate cognitive processes, jobs that traditionally took a lot of time to actually, a lot of training to actually perform, can now be done by the machine. So there's huge consequences from these changes, and something that we really need to be aware of. So I'm a big advocate for building awareness about what's happening in the world today.
Okay. So now, Rachel, as the CEO of the Global Center on AI Governance and a lead drafter of the African Union Commission's Continental AI Strategy, could you share your perspective and the current state of AI governance in Africa, as well as what are the primary challenges and opportunities that you have observed thus far?
Thank you, OTD. In some ways, I think it might be helpful for me to build off Chris's input about what is artificial intelligence, because what it is and what its impacts are in the world is really what we're trying to govern for and shape. And I think very often the conversations around governance encompass so many different things, it's quite hard to talk about it in a singular way. So, Chris was talking about how AI is like a human brain. It learns and it responds to its environment. And what's quite interesting now is that we're at a kind of time in the evolution of artificial intelligence where we now have the kind of systems performing in a way that we were once very worried about. So major kind of ethical questions in artificial intelligence were around a machine or a system that could act in the world, in a digital world, but it has material impacts in the real world with a degree of autonomy, and that we could never fully know or understand, because its layers of processing are so deep and so complex. We could never fully know and understand how it arrived at a particular decision or why it took a particular action. And that's really interesting for me, because for a long time we had AI systems that were far more basic levels of machine learning, where they weren't acting with significant degrees of autonomy in the world, and we could, to some degree, explain how they arrived at a particular decision or outcome. Now with agentic AI, which is the kind of latest evolution of the technology that's available for people to use, is doing that. And I think we're kind of confronted with those ethical challenges that we imagined some years ago and now really, really kind of crystal clear in the world. So AI governance is really about responding to a number of things. It's about responding to the ethical challenges that AI raises, that it is something non-human that takes actions in the world that impact humans, and impact humans in ways that could be very detrimental, or it could be really positive. So it could it could help somebody's ability to access their human rights, or it could limit it. That it behaves in ways that we cannot ever fully know and understand, and so it raises questions around kind of transparency. So that's one side of AI governance, is how do we ensure that these systems behave in a way that upholds the values that are important to us, the ethical values that are important to us in our societies. And importantly, within African conversations, we've spoken about how the ethical values that are important in some parts of the world may not be precisely the same as the ethical values that are important here. So some of the kind of issues that are raised here has been really important to things like solidarity, and also education and awareness, that we need to build people's understandings around these technologies and how they act. But some of the other ways that we speak about governance is managing and regulating and safeguarding. So this is much more on the kind of harder law side, the very real risks and harms that this technology can pose. And there's a set of different conversations going on around what that should look like. One of the crystal laws that we have in place at the moment that helps regulate that is data protection laws, which regulate the processing of personal information that's used in many or most AI systems to one degree or another. And then the kind of last part of AI governance, and which is why it's quite hard to talk about AI governance in one umbrella term when it means a number of different things, is about how do we design a set of policy choices within usually a kind of national context that enables this technology to be harnessed for the benefit of our society, or to be harnessed in ways that help advance the realization of different developmental priorities. And I think for me, these different objectives of AI governance, to deal with, to uphold certain set of ethical values, to create an enabling environment for inclusive growth, to manage risks and harms at different levels, is never going to be dealt with within one kind of policy or instrument. And that is where I think we're at a very, very early and emerging stage around AI governance, because across the continent, what we have is AI strategies emerging slowly. So Ghana is the latest African country it's hoping to publish it's published a draft, but it's hoping to have that kind of formalized by June this year. But a strategy, and I'm sure Michael will speak to this more, is really just the first instrument in a set of governance tools that can be used to govern and shape how AI is used within a specific domain or jurisdiction. So after you have strategies, then you move to policies, and in South Africa we have both a strategy and a policy in the works, and then you might think about different kind of sectoral level regulations that might support the implementation of different pieces, or even further policy instruments. And at a regional level too, that's certainly where we're at. But we have a continental AI strategy that I was part of the drafting of, But in and of itself, it's only kind of earmarking and pointing a flag to these are the issues that are important for our continent, and further work is needed to really see through the implementation of these kind of strategy ideas and provisions.
Okay, thank you. Now, speaking on the point that you had made on ethics, as I am a student myself, I would like to ask, as students are getting involved on these AI systems such as ChatGPT and making use of it, what would be a better way of handling such a situation? Because many students aren't sure or educated on how exactly to use that, because some would just like copy and paste whichever answer that ChatGPT had given them according to the prompt that they had set in. So would it be better to either limit the use of ChatGPT, forbid it, or would it be better for educators or lecturers or even specialists such as yourself to go and educate students on the use of it and how to use it correctly? What would your take be? Or
I actually deal with this quite often in some of the work that I do. So I go around and I do these AI skills roadshows, and so I speak to students and I speak to lecturers. And we talk about the value of prompting and the value of needing to understand what these tools can do. And so, I mean, it's a very complicated space, perhaps, in the higher education sector right now. And it seems like the academics they have this gut reaction where they're not very supportive of the tools. But I feel like this is a negative mindset to have. We need to be recognizing the potential that these tools have for learning. And we need to perhaps change the way we teach. And so I often say that the space for written assignments perhaps is changing. The value of that as a tool for learning is perhaps not as strong as it used to be in the past, because, as you say, it's very easy to copy and paste. And so what are you learning in that process? So rather what I'd advocate for is that we start to use the tool as an instrument for critical learning. And so how do you engage with the subject matter? How do you make sense of it? Michael and I were just chatting now before we started about Notebook LM and the power that you can have to condense multiple different streams of papers, inputs in one go and get an overview of an entire space very quickly. These are wonderful instruments for learning. And I'd really like to see the academic sector recognize the potential and think about how you integrate it in as a tool for learning.
I agree on that also. So Krish, you are currently working on developing an AI-powered career guidance tool for Africa's youth. How does that work, or how will it work, and what impact can AI have in how we address career guidance challenges in the African context?
Yeah, so we're social scientists. I mean, we're talking about technology today, but our focus has been on understanding the world that we live in. And so within our research division, we've been studying livelihoods now for many years. And understanding the world of work, we're finding it so complicated that the world is changing and the world of work is so dynamic. There's aspects of hustling that come into it, understanding the work that exists within the informal space, the work that exists in the formal sector, and how do you get this overview about all the different opportunities that are available to you. And so, given that it's so complex, that the traditional ways of us providing advice to young people, I think, is failing them right now, because it's very difficult to get an overview about how the world of work actually, what it looks like. And the problem is that bad advice is actually damaging. So a young person that's looking for a pathway for themselves about what they should be exploring, perhaps they get told, think about medicine, think about law, and maybe that's not really their passion. Yeah. And then they go down a road that's potentially difficult to access, and if they fail, you feel all kinds of depressive thoughts, and perhaps it's not the best way to start off your career. So good advice is what we need, but how do we get good advice? And the funny thing that we're finding is that while AI and technology is perhaps a source of some of the challenges that we see, that work keeps changing. Some jobs are becoming redundant. Some jobs are becoming augmented through technology. But at the same time, technology and AI can be a tool to make sense of all of this. And so you've got to try and balance these two different, potentially competing ideas in your mind. And what that means is that we can now start to use AI to get a sense about all the different job opportunities that exist in this hustling space, that exist in this informal space, and the formalities, and then identify what are those opportunities that are actually there. And that's what we're trying to do with this new project that we have. What we'd like to be able to, we've just started, by the way, and so we're extracting data from 5 different countries, South Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, Ghana, and Senegal, and we're trying to build pictures about the world of work in each of these spaces. And then based on real-world data, we'll be able to provide advice based on what's actually happening right now. And we want to do this on a more frequent basis, monthly, potentially weekly, so that we can start to develop this picture about where the opportunities actually are. And so when we give advice, it's based on what actually exists and not based on what we think might be the situation. And we think that will be the value add that we provide. It's a strange place to be in, because on one hand, the technology is, as I've been saying, it's the source of the change, but it's perhaps also a tool for us to understand the space better.
Okay. Then, Michael, considering your interest in formulating national AI policies and responsive AI practices, how do you assess the progress of African nations such as South Africa in developing and implementing AI policies?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think, as Rachel mentioned, emerging slowly is the term. And in South Africa, at least, where we have been involved, there's been a lot of very interesting deliberation, but we're not at the point of a finalized strategy or policy yet, really. And it might make more sense to take a step back and look at the overall path. With the watershed, I think, being around 2023, when generative AI really came on the scene. But prior to that, even, for example, through the 4IR Commission that ran from 2018 to 2020, there was very strong policy interest in AI. And at that time, what we see now was a kind of science fiction. It wasn't understood that we were that close to generative or agentic AI. But there was still understanding of its potential and policy support that came out of the recommendations of that commission. For example, establishing an AI institute, which ended up happening at the University of Johannesburg. But those were not binding recommendations. And they were kind of, in my view, a bit held back by World Economic Forum framing of what was happening. So there was this political deliberative process that led to a policy understanding, but there wasn't direct implementation of those recommendations. And also they were based on a pre-2023 concept of what AI is or could be. But there has been progress in 2024. I think following these changes, the Department of Communications and Digital Technologies released an AI policy framework, which, if you look at the nomenclature, isn't a strategy, it isn't a policy, it's input towards potential strategies and policies. And that was a really positive step, taking the conversation forward and, identifying, again, earmarking what are the areas we're looking at, what are the priorities. There are 9 strategic pillars. We've discussed most of them: capacity development, rolling it out in the public sector, the research side, the ethics, privacy, security, and transparency and bias. So the issues are there and have been discussed, but again, this is not a binding strategy, it's not a binding policy, it's the conversation. So where we are in South Africa, I think, is still in the deliberative phase. The DSTI is currently leading a process of a consultative methodology to arrive at recommendations to a national strategy. Again, it's all so far been discussion. So South Africa has not been idle in the conversation, but we have also not crossed the line from discussion into strategy and implementation, and that's where I'm really hoping there's progress. I'm hoping that the government departments work better together, because there are sometimes kind of territorial claims to AI policy which are not necessarily constructive. And also, due to the rate of change, if your policy arrives after the tech has changed, you're going to need different policy. So you need a shorter policy cycle.
Okay. Interesting. So, Rachel, your forthcoming book, The New Empire of AI, The Future of Global Inequality, it delves into AI's impact on global disparities. How can African countries ensure that AI development contributes to reducing inequality rather than magnifying it?
Yeah, thank you. The book is already out. It came out in the UK at the end of last year, and in the US and other regions earlier this year. This is a really, really important question, and not a question that I think is easily answered. I think very often there's an assumption that the use of artificial intelligence within key domains like healthcare and education and agriculture is automatically going to be inclusive. And I think this is really, really dangerous. This is dangerous because it doesn't enable us to learn from the lessons of ICT for development over the past kind of 20 years, which one of the kind of critical findings was around the digital divide, particularly in the African continent. And this is a really, really stark divide between, people who have access to the internet and the technologies it brings, and people whose access is not stable and not guaranteed, or can be guarded, which is quite an interesting point when we look at the gender differential between people who have access to the internet and those who don't. And this kind of particular gender digital divide is arguably becoming worse as internet technologies are enabling access to artificial intelligence and these other technologies and capabilities that may lead to different kind of pathways of prosperity, which means that they become more strategic and more valuable, and so men may restrict women's access to them. So I think thinking very, very carefully about questions of access when we're looking at the adoption of technologies in, for example, education, becomes really, really important to thinking about how do we do this inclusively. So that's kind of one layer of it. How do we ensure access beyond a kind of one laptop per child model, which we know is not a model that's going to work? The second one is around how we design the systems themselves. So one of the kind of major ethical concerns that where there's huge documented evidence of harms is around how biased these systems are, particularly towards people of colour and particularly towards women. And this is scarily well documented, and understanding how these biases occur is connected to the first issue I described and is important for trying to address it. But effectively, these systems are built off learning patterns of huge data sets. And where data sets overrepresent the particular worldviews and perspectives and experiences of particular groups, it's going to tend to produce a bias towards those groups and those outcomes because it's based on probability. So if there are people who have less access to the internet, which is where the majority of training data comes from for AI, their perspectives and the kind of evidence around their lives that would go into building an AI system is not adequately represented. And so these systems naturally, in some ways, tend to be biased against them, which can result in different kinds of things. I mean, one of the things I spoke about in my book is around how large language models, so when Michael was talking about generative AI, this is really kind of large language models that are then able to produce outcomes or outputs that are considered in alignment with kind of human expectations. But if they are all in English language, and I think there's kind of statistics that show that only 2% of the trainer data of these large language models are African languages, then it's going to in some ways bias a Western worldview. And we've certainly seen this bias being proved over again. And I think there's an example I use in my book of journalists in Uganda who are using ChatGPT to write up an article about their country, and it was saying how problematic Uganda, like national Ugandan views were towards LGBTQI communities, which of course from a Western perspective it really is very problematic, but it is not necessarily reflective of the particular kind of national position there. So it's a complex issue to look at, but certainly one that when we're thinking about how do we make these technologies inclusive and serve everyone, we need to think more widely. And so another one is how we design these systems, and how we design these systems not just to bring in data and include be more representative in whose world experiences it's trained on and it's able to respond to, but also how we design these systems or build systems that are by nature more inclusive, which might be building large language models in local African languages. And there's work being done towards doing that. So I think there's a number of issues around the kind of rising levels of inequality. Those are a couple, but the others are really around kind of AI as a major industrial strategy in the West, right? Which is not less. I mean, in our context, we think about how AI is going to help advance realization of developmental goals and developmental priorities, but in other parts of the world, it's how is this going to enable us to get ahead industrially, because it helps us make huge productivity leaps and bring about significant raises in productivity and GDP. And which was another thing I wrote about, but if we see, countries in the West or very well developed Asia get really quite far ahead in terms of raising levels of GDP and raising wealth, and not that that's going to be equitably distributed within those places either, then we're going to see a sort of widening gap between where these countries are at and then where countries in Africa are at, who are not able to progress at the same rate of knots. So there's statistics that say that by 2030, 90% of the world's poor will be based in the African continent, whereas there's other statistics that say that by 2030, every other part of the world is going to see really significant GDP growth from AI. And Africa is also supposed to see increased GDP growth, but it's not at all at the level that's comparable to the other regions. And we also know that wealth is not going to be fairly distributed unless we take extraordinary policy measures to try and plan it as such, which is quite complex, and perhaps we can spend some time thinking about what those measures are. I certainly don't have all the answers, but I do think that there's room to act, and I think now is the time for daring and imaginative policy choices to be made to try and make sure that this technology does serve everyone more equitably and more beneficially.
Yes. So now going off of Rachel's point of digital systems being more West-leaning, Krish, you developed the AI-powered Refracted Economies Career Guidance Tool, in short ARC, with the aim of providing contextualized career advice. Could you elaborate on how your system overcomes inherent bias in AI?
Yeah. So Rachel's given a good background to how these biases emerge. It's all about the digital inequality that we see in the world today. Just to add to that point, I saw there's a shocking statistic that just echoes in my mind quite often. I found out that the total electricity supply in the whole continent of Africa equates to that of what Spain produces. So if you think about us, we are 1 billion plus people on the continent, but we have the same electricity production power of Spain, which has about 50 million people. So you can see the inequality that's there. And so just based on that limited supply that we have, think about how few people actually have access to computers, to the internet, and from that actually contributing to the supply of data which actually exists online. And so what that then means is that the training data, as Rachel was saying, is very unbalanced. And so the majority of the information is actually being drawn from these Western countries. And so that becomes very dangerous for us if we want to be providing timely career advice to our young people. So, I mean, you could go onto ChatGPT and say, I'm interested in A, B, and C, and it will provide you some response. But the quality of that response is going to be not based on your local context, right? And so it'll tell you something. Maybe there'll be some value in the advice that it does offer, but it's lacking various things. And so that's why we've paid very close attention to where we're going to be sourcing the information from. And so by feeding a model with local data, you start to elevate it. So if the neural network that ChatGPT is based on looks for that average of all the data that's there, it's going to give you that Western picture. If we complement that with local information and then focus our attention on the information that we provide it can then provide you insights based on that subset of information, which is our context, the experiences that are happening in the real world, which will inform the advice that we give the young people. And hopefully, we're still working on it, so we haven't got a finished product as yet. But I'd like to see that actually resolves this bias question.
Yes, hopefully it will. Michael, your work ranges from supporting national policy development to measuring public perceptions of AI and reflecting on the African perspective on AI. How do you see the future of AI and the social science research agenda on AI going forward?
Thanks. Yeah, that is a question we need to think about at the HSRC. As the Human Sciences Research Council, we need to reflect on what kind of AI-related research is going to be relevant going forward. How do we prioritize? What agendas do we set? And that's a real challenge to define an AI social science agenda because it's so enormously broad. It cuts across every sector chronologically. It can go forward quite far in time. And there's so many distinct applications. So it really is trying to work through that information to determine the agenda. But what we do know is that in the future, our research agenda will be shaped by how things go, what kind of AI future we have in store for us. And one thing we do know is that trying to predict an AI future means you're going to be wrong because it's going to surprise us. It's full of surprises, and we caught in that space. But what we can do is take a bit of creative license and try and imagine some ways in which AI could move forward, and therefore in what ways the research agenda could move with that, based on some of the narratives that we see around us. And those narratives are diverse, and they range from optimistic to highly pessimistic, and a couple of ones in between. And those, depending on what direction it takes, we'll respond. So the AI optimist narrative promises a kind of techno-utopia where AI solves a whole bunch of problems. It really downplays the risks, and it ties into the kind of narratives that come from Silicon Valley venture capital, from kind of transhumanist narratives, And to me, this is really encapsulated in Elon Musk's fascination with E&M banks, where it's a future where AI and humans are fully merged. The work has fallen away. AI does all our work for us. It's really utopian, and the boundaries between humans and machines have been erased. And if you consider that optimistic, I would say there's a bunch of success risks, even in a best case scenario. Where's the energy going to come from? What happens to our humanity? So to me, in a best case scenario, we'd be looking at those kinds of questions. In the longer term. In the medium term, it would be more focused on leveraging AI for developmental goals, and in an African context for industrial goals. But in the long term, the best case scenario leads us there. To me, the middle ground, I think, in terms of ways forward for research, is looking at power relations in AI. If you look at the work of Yanis Varoufakis, Zizek, the concept of techno-feudalism is interesting, not just because it sounds like a steampunk novel, but because it really focuses on power relations in which tech giants own whole sections of the internet. They use AI to monetize it and extract value from the public. It's a troublesome power relations picture that we see. And also bearing in mind Shoshana Zuboff's idea of surveillance capitalism really being on steroids. Once you add AI to that, the capacity for surveillance and the processing of surveilled information goes off the charts. So there, I think we really need to have a critical voice, speak truth to power, and challenge centers of power that are really phenomenal. If you look at what's happening in America, such close integration between Washington and Silicon Valley. Really, some of the directions pointed out by Yanis, I think, are coming to pass. But that's not the worst case scenario. To me, that's a kind of middle ground. There are narratives also coming from, I think, Silicon Valley and the Republican Party that are more extreme. And Naomi Klein really, to me, hit the nail on the head on this one by saying that there's a kind of apocalyptic scenario which aligns with both the narratives of the Republican far right and also the behavior of Silicon Valley execs who buy bunkers in New Zealand because they're simultaneously preparing for the end of the world and accelerating the end of the world. So obviously you need a bunker in that situation. But within these kinds of negative scenarios, there is distinctions. I think one is a fear of a kind of chaos in which the broad impacts and essentially difficult to predict impacts of AI in so many areas breach a whole bunch of tipping points. The social fabric unravels. There's increased volatility and unpredictability and erosion of access to truth, conflict, these kinds of fears. And then on the extreme end, a research agenda that plays out, for example, in the Leverhulme Center for the Study of Existential Risk. They look at AI in the military. The tech bros like to use the term a non-zero chance. There's a non-zero chance that AI will one way or another lead to the end of civilization. So that's the radical kind of doomsday scenario. To me, vanishingly unlikely, but non-existent. And there we really need to focus. If that's where we go, we need to focus on as Leverhulme are doing, what are the actual risks? Let's go beyond the rhetoric. So we're trying to adapt to all of these narratives. The team at the HSRC, is taking forward various agendas. We're looking at public perceptions. We just got data from a national survey. It's going to be really interesting to see what South Africans actually think and feel about AI. And generally, for now, focusing on broad policy-oriented and development-oriented research that can inform the policy.
Okay. Now, from the negatives that you had mentioned, which leads to the next part of the discussion, what do you say to youth who have this fear of AI or the digital systems taking over their jobs? And it's an open question.
Yeah. So I guess this I could draw from my experience in running these AI skills development workshops. I mean, Michael's laid out all the scenarios that we can expect, and it's scary. We're talking about this non-zero chance of civilization being wiped out, and it's just one of the long list of things that could possibly result. And so that builds the fear that's out there, and it's how do you address that sort of fear that exists among young people. And then that's part of the challenge that I've been experiencing in these workshops that I do. It's like, how do you take a realist position about how you prepare yourself for all of these eventualities that could be there? And so it's very complicated to try and figure out where things are headed. So I tend to lean on 3 or 4 points. The first thing that I say to young people is that you need to stay aware, stay current with what's going on. The only constant that's going to exist in the world of work or in the technology space is that it's going to change. And so you've got to now become adaptable, responsive to these changes. And so you've got to be almost on a daily basis keeping track of what's happening, and then thinking about how you position yourself in response to where this is going. So it's not I'll do my degree today and then I'm set for the rest of my life. You've got to commit yourself to a lifelong journey of learning. So that's the first thing. The second thing I like to say to young people is that building basic AI skills is not enough. So you can have general AI literacy, you might know how to write a prompt, but you've got to move beyond the basic level and move to a point of mastery. So understand all the different tools that are out there, understand how they're being used, understand the complications and where it's finding its data from, but try and figure out a way to master them. And so if you master them, you push yourself into a space where you can become more valuable, because one, you're boosting your own productivity, and so you're potentially being able to do new things. And then you're also exposing yourself to different spaces, different disciplines perhaps, where you could branch into. So you need to be flexible in a way that you can pivot in your career. And then the last point that I like to share with them is that you need to embrace the complexity. The world that we live in, the different spaces where we're working, it's inherently complex. I spoke about the worlds of hustling and informality. It's all of this is coming together. And the problems that we face are not simple to solve. And so you've got to figure out how do we introduce new solutions to solve these very complicated problems. It's very human for us to run away from something that's complicated, but your goal should be move towards the complexity, try to solve the complex problems, try to solve the big problems. That's how you make yourself valuable, and that's how you could potentially make a difference wherever you are.
I can just add one thing to that.
Yes, go ahead.
I'll be brief. On this question, to me at least, if you're talking to a young person that's thinking about work, one thing we can say is that AI is there. We can't go backwards, so we need to move forwards. And one of the conceptual things that need to be clear to me for a young person is that it's not humans versus AI competing for jobs. It's not a question of what can AI do versus what a human can do. To me, it's very clear that the question is, what can AI and humans together do? That is going to outperform AI and it's going to outperform humans. Mm-hmm. The question, the focus is the interface. And that bears out both in the scholarly space and in the cultural space. If you look at science fiction, it is that interface that is the kind of the forward-moving direction. So if I was speaking to a young person, I would really try and convince them to use that as a heuristic, as a rule of thumb for where they want to go.
Okay, then going off of that, as we near the end of our discussion, I'd like to invite each of you to share your reflections on the key themes that we have discussed and offer guidance to young Africans who are navigating the evolving AI landscape. In particular, Rachel, considering the ethical frameworks and governance structure we've explored, what advice would you give young Africans to ensure that AI development on the continent remains inclusive and equitable?
Yeah, thank you very much. This has been a really interesting conversation, and I've learned a lot listening to you all. And I think there's been some really good points made now about how AI and humans need to come together, and we need to be kind of realistic about what we're facing in this constantly changing world. I think we also need to remember that AI is being designed to be easier and easier to use. You don't need to know how it works to be able to use it. And so, yes, we need to kind of get over the fear of being able to use it and use it in ways that help us and help us advance in whatever kind of task that might be. I've been particularly concerned by statistics that have come out that have said that men are more likely than women to use ChatGPT. And I'm not surprised. I've seen this, even just within my own organization. I think women tend to be more risk averse and potentially more honest, and sometimes it feels like using AI can be cheating. But I think we absolutely need to use it and not be afraid to use it to get ahead. And then I think on the kind of inclusive side, from an African perspective, we need to really look carefully at where AI and AI specifically can help solve problems. So one of the applications that I have really kind of admired that comes from South Africa and is led by Gender Rights in Tech is a chatbot that helps women who have been victims of domestic violence and need to navigate through a complicated legal system and trauma to navigate this path. And it's really tapping into the fact that reporting on domestic violence can be, and it's particularly domestic violence over other forms of violence against women that tends to be most difficult to talk about. And creating a kind of digital safe space where somebody wouldn't feel stigmatized to ask silly questions is, I think, an example of how AI technologies can really be used in ways that are beneficial and are uniquely placed to help solve particular problems. So I think the more we explore what are those problems that AI is well suited to help us address here, the more we're going to able to build a world with AI that helps us into a future that is more inclusive and more equitable.
Thank you. I can actually relate to the point that you had made of AI feeling or ChatGPT feeling as if you're cheating. I had a friend who had to convince me that no, it's not cheating. It's actually a useful tool that helps make your work or job easier. So yes, I can relate to that. Krish, I believe you led an AI skills development roadshow, as you had mentioned. What advice do you offer young people to leverage AI to better prepare for the future job market, especially in the context of Africa's unique economic landscape?
Well, just building on what I mentioned previously, awareness, one, is critical. So you need to know where the technology is going and how you might apply it. And that's why I've been saying it's important for us to try and master all these different tools and then try and apply it within your own context. But the additional point I'd like to make is that you need to lean into your inherent humanity. That's the one thing that differentiates you from everybody else and how you can add value on top of what the AI can do. So if you understand the human context, the complexity of relationships, these are the things, those are the qualities that become more valuable because you'll be able to understand how you might be able to apply the technology within a typical human and complex and messy problem. And so Unfortunately, these are not the things that you're taught in school or university, so you've got to try and build your own capacities in that regard so that you can figure out how you apply that within the different spaces that you operate. But my advice is to try really lean into your own EQ, build those capacities, because those are valuable traits today.
And Michael, from a policy development perspective, what role can young Africans play in shaping national AI strategies to ensure that their voices and needs are adequately represented?
Yeah, thanks. That's a very difficult question, because the locus of decisions that go into policy are very far from where African youth are. And what we're really talking about in some senses, I guess, is the gap between the most and the least powerful, and those with the most and the least influence on AI policy. And bridging that gap is a massive challenge. And I've got a couple of points, I think, to think about on this. Firstly, where there are support mechanisms to amplify the voices of African youth when it comes to AI, those are critical. So the Global Center for AI Governance is doing this kind of work, whether it's African perspectives on AI in health or labor or higher education or gender or the framing of it or agriculture. Those are needed. Without those, there'll be very little or no input. But more broadly than that, as Krish mentioned, awareness is a key issue. And this is one of the reasons why I find the public sphere research so interesting, and I'm getting quite excited at looking at the data. What is the awareness? We don't really know much about it. What percentage of the population understand what AI is? What are the different attitudinal perspectives on AI? What are the practices? So that it's really critical to get a sound understanding of that point of departure before you can really move too much. But there's two related points that I'd like to make, and one is related to awareness, and that's the issue of transparency, which Rachel has mentioned, and Rachel has a long history of looking very closely at transparency as a concept, and I think it applies so interestingly to AI. Because to take a Terry Pratchett kind of way of putting it, there's transparency issues all the way down in AI, from the fundamental mathematical fuzziness that happens if you look far enough. We can't fully mathematically describe everything that's happening in an AI. We can't define it. It's got this kind of quantum fuzziness to it where we cannot go that far in terms of understanding what's happening. But there's transparency issues, in the corporate space, in the state space. Technologically, it's esoteric. The public have a great deal of trouble understanding how AI actually works, what it actually does. If you ask your average person, what's a transformer architecture? It's super critical to LLMs. It's not a conversation that many people can have. And there's issues of data transparency and privacy. So for me, when I think of young Africans trying to access policy, first they have to get through the challenge of awareness. They need to get through challenges of transparency, and then they need to get through challenges of actually somehow affecting policy. And that's a very difficult thing. So it's a critical project, I think, for Africans, for South Africans, for Africans, and for the Global South, I think, given that what's at stake is not our industrial competitiveness, but our human rights and our developmental goals. At any rate, there are related conversations to this, and they're playing out in the research space and the policy space. And these, I think, are related more indirectly to the potential for African youth to influence policy. It's questions of strengthening African AI capabilities and AI sovereignty as a stepping stone towards that. And there's a lot of more pragmatic debates. For example, arguments that we should have more data centers in Africa, in South Africa, arguments that we should be developing our own LLMs, like China has done with DeepSeek, and I think reasonably sound arguments that we should be developing innovation ecosystems around all the different levels of the AI value chain, whether it's energy production or hardware or software or hosting or whatever it is, as, again, a stepping stone towards broader participation. So they're both nuts and bolts kinds of issues, and quite pervasive conceptual issues to think about, I think.
Interesting. And just one more question. Do you think it's a possibility to have South Africa develop their own LBMs and the others that you had mentioned? Is that actually something that you can see happening in South Africa?
Yeah, I'll leave that one to Chris and Rachel.
I think we're not complete newbies in this space. There's actually is some progress that's happening locally in South Africa, where we're making a contribution to the space. I know colleagues at University of Pretoria, at Lelapa AI, I believe it is, where they've been building large language models trained on local data, local languages, and so that's a really great contribution. We need to be doing more. We need to be thinking about how else we can invest in this space, so that our businesses, our new small businesses as well, also can benefit from these technologies. Everything seems to be very Western oriented, Western East oriented, focusing on the capabilities that big tech is provided, but we need to think about what can we do here at home. And if I listen to Michael, the feeling that I get is that we really need to have more social scientists in this conversation. I think that's the contribution we can make here from the HSRC, because you need to be thinking about the social dynamic and how this technology is going to change the world that we live in. And all these new changes shouldn't only be driven by big tech alone.
Okay. Well, as we've heard, young people in Africa have a pivotal role to play in shaping the country's AI future, and by engaging with these technologies thoughtfully and proactively is essential. So thank you to our esteemed panelists, Rachel Adams, Krish Shetty and Michael Gasjo, for sharing their invaluable insights. For those interested in delving deeper, feel free to reach out to the panelists through or via HSRC. And be sure to follow our YouTube channel for more discussions on pivotal topics such as this. Thank you all for participating in today's session, and to our viewers for joining us on HSRC Connect. It's been a pleasure on both ends. Let's continue the conversation and work together towards a future where AI fairly serves all Africans.